Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay, North Division Championship Edition. The entirety of Major League Quidditch made way for our first ever North Division Championship, and it was an absolute treat. All three of our analysts here today, myself, Nick Jablonski, and Jack McGovern, were able to go and see it in person. It was a beautiful, beautiful facility out in South Bend. The grass was immaculate. We all agreed in our car ride home, probably some of the best grass we've ever seen Quidditch played on. The teams kind of made it a great weekend. It was really enjoyable, and there's a lot to talk about. Nick, how was your weekend in South Bend?
It was a little difficult some days. The weather played a part, and the internet in South Bend not that great. But overall, the teams made it an awesome experience. Great location. Definitely
Yep.
well worth the trip.
And for those who struggled with the stream all weekend, as Nick alluded to, we apologize. It was the internet connectivity problems. It was nothing we could do. It's the exact same setup we've used in all of our series. That said, Nick is always saving copies of every single recording locally. It's not, it's not just a pulled down version of the stream that goes up on our YouTube. It is a idealized version. So as those go up over the week, Nick obviously has more games to do than he does on a regular week. But as those go up over the week, you can expect them in the high definition that you've come to expect from our series of the week. So keep a lookout on the MLQ network for that. Jack, how was your weekend?
It was great. It was really nice to welcome Nick and Ethan, you guys to the Midwest, and everyone from MLQ. Got to take Nick out to dinner on Friday night. So it's one of my favorite breweries, so it was a good time.
Yeah, and also the hospitality of Reed Marchman and Steffi Hoffman Marchman. I apologize. I don't know if she took Reed's name. Also, we really appreciate it. We had a great time with them as well. So let's start talking about Quidditch. And the way we wanted to break this down, we're going to go team by team. We had 6 teams participate this weekend. I'll just read through the results really fast. So the first game was an elimination game between Detroit and Cleveland. That Detroit came out 1-2-0, eliminating Cleveland. Then Indianapolis and Toronto were playing for the 3rd seed in the North Division, which Indianapolis took 2-0. That dropped Toronto down to play for the 4th seed against Detroit on Sunday. Toronto did end up winning that one. And then finally, the championship match was for the 1st and 2nd seed between Minneapolis and Rochester, and Minneapolis swept that series to take down their 2nd straight North Division title. They are now 2nd all-time alone. They passed Rochester in North Division titles. Indianapolis holds the all-time record for North Division titles with, I believe, 4. So we'll work our way up. We're going to start with the teams we just saw on Saturday, move to the teams we saw the most of, and then the teams we just saw on Sunday. So let's start with the Cleveland Riff, who finished their season without a win, but who gave Detroit 2 very strong games on Saturday, really games that turned in very small moments. Game 1, I'm thinking of kind of just the snitch grab and a streak of play right before the 20-minute mark where a 40-0 run for Detroit kind of spelt Cleveland's doom. And then down the stretch in Game 2, really just the Gaffigan injury, I think, when Cleveland was leading up until that point. Jack, what do you think of this Cleveland team and kind of the way they've come along this season?
Yeah, Cleveland has shown that they're a team that has multiple players who can drive and dish. And when their beaters are making tap beats and taking out high defending chasers, they can cause a lot of problems for a defense. So it was great to see the progress over the course of the season from a player like Peter Brechting stepping up into a bigger role and really feeling comfortable as a ball carrier, finding chasers like Melissa Staup and Carrie Britson on the wings. When Cleveland was playing at their best, the offense was clicking for them like that.
Yeah, for sure. Nick, what did you see from Cleveland this weekend?
I really like their adjustments against zone. We saw this team struggle against zone all throughout the year, and this weekend they clearly came in and had a plan for it, and were attacking very aggressively at the hoops with those beaters who were consistently winning engages against many of these Detroit beaters. And they were using that to attack the hoop defenders, which allowed for Gaffigan to do what Gaffigan does best, and that's hit those mid-range shots, which he definitely did very strongly before he went down with an injury.
Yeah, I do think he learned some of his lessons from earlier in the season where he was trying to shoot in zones at times less effectively. And he said, if that means to drive all the way to the hoop in these no blunders, I think his dunk rate was way up compared to what it usually is, where he's usually more willing to settle for those shots. In the beater game, I think a number of good showings. Austin Howe, the beater coach of the team, had good showings. Ben Strauss showed just moments where he was transcendent in the way we know he can be. There was a stretch down the end of game 2, right about when Cleveland had its life on the line, 2 or 3 possessions in a row where he was just the best player, like the best beater on the weekend. Just the way he was playing for those couple stretches. We didn't necessarily see it all weekend. It does seem like minutes and who they're able to get consistently, because we saw really bright spots from Rianne Barnes as well, but seems like maybe she hasn't been able to be with the team as much, wasn't able to be as involved. So I think the pieces are there. It's good to see a young team. I know they have some pieces from Kent State that got some action in game 3. They're hoping that Kent State can go official. Right now, that's kind of what Cleveland needs. It needs to build up its pipeline again. And the college programs, they've been in a bit of a downslope over the last half decade at this point, I think, since we saw, the real strength of Bowling Green and Ohio State. So it'll be interesting to see how those younger players can come along. Nick, any other notes you had about this Cleveland team this weekend?
Yeah, you talked about how they don't necessarily seem to play what we think might be their best players huge minutes, but I think that's really valuable for this team. This team is one that is getting better each time it plays, and that's due to the fact that these players are getting competitive minutes at a high level. And as we work to see that in the future years, I expect these programs to just come back stronger and stronger.
Yeah, and I we'll be honest. Obviously, it isn't the beater game. I mean, Gaffigan did play, I think, the entire first 20 minutes of game 1, and pretty close to that in game 2 before he got injured. I really think Cleveland. I mean, I think their beater game has seemed competitive for good stretches of every game. I think Toronto was the exception, but Ben Strauss wasn't at that series, so obviously a little different. Even against Rochester, I thought they looked really solid. They just need scores that aren't Gaffigan and Brechting. They're right now almost all of their points are coming from those two sources, and that's just not a realistic way for a Quidditch team to work out. Even if for a game someone's going to take over and score a lot of the goals, you need more options when someone gets taken out of a game either through injury or through strategic changes on the defense from the opposition. Jack, do you have any other thoughts on Cleveland?
Yeah, I think you're right. It was just a bit too one-dimensional at times, too reliant on the drive and dish game. In the beater game, I'll give shout outs to Jillian DeKeel, who played some big minutes, as well as Kyle Dawson, who was starting for them a good bit throughout the weekend. I thought those two lesser-known names really stepped up and played well for the Riff.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's move on to the other team that we only saw on Saturday of this weekend. I apologize. The Indianapolis Intensity. Indianapolis, if you weren't following this weekend, was ravaged by COVID. I don't know what the final total was. It might have crossed in the double digits, the number of players that they ended up losing from their roster for COVID. They still come out, and it specifically was the beater lines that were absolutely decimated. They still come out and they get the job done. They take it to Toronto for 2 straight games. Nathan Digman back with the team after missing the last weekend. Riley Andrews back with the team for the first time since picking up an injury, I think in a pregame scrimmage against Kansas City. Jack, you're obviously very, very familiar with this Indy team. Did you have concerns given all the COVID, and did anything surprise you about the way they came out despite it?
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke to Nathan Digman before the first game, the head coach of the Intensity, and he said, "You know what you're up. You know what we're up against today." So the whole team felt that they were having their backs against the walls heading into the series. I believe they had one beater, Matt Brown, who had played beater the previous weekend against Minneapolis. They had Ben Peachy, who beat for Boom Train, but I think exclusively chased against the Monarchs, slide back in at beater and start. And then they relied on Nivas Jayaram to step up, incoming Columbia captain, to play some big minutes. Riley Andrews was a utility option for the team. Mary Owens, who has beaten the past, stepped in. So with only one beater from the previous weekend, it was kind of all hands on deck, and they handled themselves well. Just a sign of the togetherness that the team plays with and the belief they have in themselves.
Yeah, definitely a next player up mentality out of this Indy team. Um, and Peachy obviously has a really really nice series I think throughout, and a player like Jyrem, when I was talking to Nathan Digman before the series, he was saying, have basically been prepping him for this possibility, like the need to go into beater depth at some point during the season all year long. And it's similar with Peachy. Peachy not always been a beater, and obviously was chasing a week ago. Uh, and you mentioned it, Indy's back up against the wall. Toronto they had their own depth issues, and we'll get into a little bit as we go down. But Indy's depth issues were so that they really didn't want to have to come back and play for the fourth seed the next day. I think it meant a lot to this team to be able to get the win in 2 games. Of course, one of the players you mentioned, Riley Andrews, I mentioned as well, playing true utility, beater, chaser, seeker, ended, I believe, game 1 with a quaffle goal and ended game 2 with a snitch grab. Nick, what did you see from Riley Andrews, and what do you think he adds to this team as this team looks forward to championships?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Nathan Digman being the heart and soul of this team, but Riley Andrews was a true contributor and very, very important. We've talked a lot about the stagnation of this Indianapolis team, sort of on the offensive side, and the unwillingness to move with the ball in hand or waiting off ball. And Riley Andrews was cutting, making consistent, threatening looks. One of the prettiest passes this whole weekend was a Riley Andrews backdoor cut, catch and finish, ball barely touches his hands in game 2, and really incredible, like just a huge add for this team heading into championships.
Yeah, for sure. We talked a little bit, Jack, last week after the sweep by Indianapolis, about those continued concerns about zone breaking for Indianapolis. In our midweek preview that me and Nick did on the Patreon, I asked Nick about it, and he said, and his answer was 2 words. It was just Nathan Digman. How do you think Nathan Digman performed offensively for Indianapolis this weekend?
Yeah, Digman is obviously a player who can beat almost any defender in the sport one-on-one in the open field. He can block bludgers. He's just a mismatch. And in the first game, I think he tallied 6 goals in the end. And in the second game, his goal scoring output was lower, but he was dishing assists. And that was the game that the Intensity really felt proudest about afterwards, the way that they kind of shut the door and shared the ball, and they felt it was more of a team effort. But game 1, just really an outstanding performance from Digman, showing what he can do on the pitch.
Yeah, I say this unofficially because I don't have the stats in front of me, but when we were a back of notebook set keeping during the series, I believe he was the lead scorer on Saturday, 10 goals in those 2 games. Lead scorer amongst all teams that were playing on Saturday. Nick, one of the issues that Indianapolis ran into in that first game, as Jack said, they really shut the game in game 2, was when Toronto started bringing the physicality. And I mean, Digman had to got the wind knocked out of him, had to take a step back. I know Peyton J came down with injury as well. It seems like Indianapolis slowly adjusted to that physicality. We talked sometimes about how maybe last season North Division teams didn't necessarily get proper preparation for MLQ Championship just because they didn't see all the things that you might see for some of those teams. Do you think Indianapolis is going to be able to be more prepared for championship? And since we haven't really seen their full squad altogether, what do you think this team's ceiling is at this point?
I mean, death, taxes, and Nathan Digman doubled over on a Quidditch pitch. That's just what happens, right? He takes a hit, he comes right back in. This team we've talked about, they have a physicality about them on the defensive end. It's more so the unwillingness to drive into contact from a lot of their players on the offensive end that I think they need to sort out. And if that's your biggest problem, which it might not be for this Indianapolis team, but if that's one of your bigger problems, you can drill that for the next month very consistently and really think about that and focus on that one aspect of this game, then I think they have a good chance. I'm not necessarily going to say they're anything more. They're the third seed. Quarterfinals. I think they fight through the quarterfinals, and I think they give a good game to whoever they end up seeded against.
Yeah. I push back on that a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily unwillingness. I think they were too willing to take hits, and they kind of got a wake up call from Toronto a little bit there because we talked about, that Indianapolis Minneapolis series. It wasn't the most physical series in the world, and when you start feeling like you can win all your one on ones, and then you show up here and Toronto literally punches you in the gut a couple times. Well, not literally, hits you in the gut with their bodies a couple times. Not going to accuse Toronto of throwing any illegal punches here. Um, you have to change things up. And I think they started just getting that ball out a second earlier. And when you have, off ball options like Kenny Murphy out on the field, like Cole Collins on the field, a lot of times you can get the ball out a second early and let those players work. Jack, what do you think of Nick's assessment of this team's ceiling and kind of what they could do at championships?
Yeah, I think I agree. The play-in bracket is definitely going to be a tough task for the Intensity with teams like the Charlotte Aviators and one of Kansas City or San Antonio maybe or New Orleans hanging around. Uh, they're going to have to be at their best that weekend. But I think if all goes right, they can certainly make their way through. My concerns with the Intensity are more about how they handle the press from beaters defensively. In the past few years, they've faced San Antonio and just have not been able to avoid costly turnovers when their beaters are losing exchanges. We didn't see too many North teams with an aggressive beater press and looking to counterattack. Although Toronto certainly brought some of that, but we didn't see the hyperactivity that I think we'll see from some teams at MLQ championships, especially Charlotte, which could very well be their first round matchup.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see. Worth mentioning that, of course, in the 2021 San Antonio matchup, Tad Walters and Matt Brown both not with that team. They will both be on the team. That is a very different beater game. Plus, Peachy continuing to develop as a beater, assuming he'll be beating at championships as well. So, it'll be interesting to see how that all breaks down. I think another important thing, if it does come to fruition, is that one of the things when we were talking about Indy and Minneapolis last weekend, we said, when you're trying to play spoiler, it really helps if you can catch snitches, because that 35 boost is a really good way to potentially play spoiler. You can kind of see all those close games Charlotte played this season off of those snitch grabs, sometimes even when they were kind of getting bossed in the qualifier game. So if Riley Andrews can actually be a seeking factor for this team, I think maybe that ups their ceiling or ups their chances at an upset a little bit higher than they were before this weekend. So let's move on to our next team. So these are our two teams who faced off for the fourth place spot. The fourth seed, and we'll start with the team that fell short, which is the Detroit Innovators, sweeping Cleveland on day one, but coming back and getting swept in a couple of pretty close games, specifically Game 2, where a big catch by Luke Markland gave them a chance that they just couldn't quite score enough goals for. And I think let's start on a high note, which is I think the beating game. So Nick, what did you see from Detroit's beating game this weekend?
The Ryan Shu Ray Brodeur beating pair is special. It's maybe we haven't talked about them a lot this year, but what they were able to go out and do, the turnovers they were able to force, and sort of the chaos they were able to instill in the beginning of games for this Detroit team definitely helped. Detroit came out on, I believe, 2-0 runs on both Game 1 and Game 2 against Toronto, and that's largely in part to that beating pair.
Yeah, Jack, what have you been seeing from that young beating pair this weekend?
Yeah, I mentioned a moment ago that not many teams were utilizing all of their press opportunities on defense and throwing bludgers forward. Sue and Brodeur were an exception to that. They were flying out, recognizing immediately whenever they had the opportunity. And it was really impressive to see. I've loved watching their growth over the course of the past year. I remember watching them with Michigan at regionals, and I caught one of their games at nationals too. And it's just been really exciting to see how they've developed and now playing at the highest level and making a real impact.
Okay. And I think it's so much of what you guys are talking about, the willingness to be a bit more aggressive. And, you know, it's really I'm no part of teaching beating is easy. It's easier to teach the beating fundamentals, kind of like being around hoops, taking safe exchanges and whatnot, than it is to teach aggression. You don't see a ton of beater aggression in the college game. I mean, you might see like a really, really experienced beater like a Jack Wang playing super aggressively in the college game, but you're not seeing a lot of people doing it. So to see them kind of stepping up, being comfortable in that. And yes, did it occasionally lead to a mistake where, the other team would get behind or they'd give a bunch of control a little bit too easy? Maybe. But they were also creating turnovers that this team wasn't getting in other ways. And I think, part of it is their development. Part of it is also, some of the players they've been able to play with this season, which is the other beating line we saw a lot of this weekend, which was David Bannis and David Weir. In the Cleveland series specifically, those two took over entire periods of the series with their hyper aggression, which is, I think, something they probably feed off of these two lines together. I think the difference is that come the Toronto series, the Brodeur Sue pair were able to balance their aggression, and I think the we'll just call them the two Davids. The two Davids were a little bit too over aggressive, and that started to spell trouble sometimes. Specifically, the stretch of game right before the 20-minute mark in game two, where Toronto ran off a 40-0 run in a blink of an eye through just a series of no budget opportunities. Nick, what were you kind of seeing in that time where things started to get away from Detroit in game one of that series?
I mean, Detroit was scoring a lot of their goals in those transition forced opportunities, right? And when they're asked to slow down and they're asked to drive through a set, very physical Toronto defense, they ended up not necessarily taking their chances, and that led to a lot of forced lofted passes, which allowed Toronto to sort of run and get out in space, which I think definitely helps with that side of things. I think the fact is that Toronto, another team that we'll talk about struggling a little bit in the half court this weekend, but when they were out in transition, they had players like Brian Melchior, they had players like Custers, they had players like Howie finding the open lanes and taking them. And the fact is that when Detroit is lofting these passes because of their unwillingness to drive, you're going to give up transition opportunities the other way.
Yeah, I think you're right. So you talk about the difference in the transition game, and it did feel like Toronto was taking its no budget transitions, and sometimes Detroit didn't have the answer. What we've seen from Detroit all season, Jack, I feel like is really a solid passing game. Every player on in the quaffle game is comfortable ball in hand, comfortable moving the ball, but eventually those passes have to involve somebody either taking it to the hoops or taking a shot. We saw some of the shooting, specifically from Jack Levi. It didn't feel like we saw a ton of driving from anybody on Detroit.
Yeah, I think some of their opportunities were limited in game one because of the hoop defense that Cleveland was playing. I'll say I've been impressed with the passing offense from Detroit throughout the season, and I think they were making use of the spaces that were given to them. So especially in the first games against the Riff, the spaces behind the hoops, players like Akash Srinivasan were really going to work. Jeanette High, I think, had a hat trick against the Raiders on day two. So I thought they were circulating the ball well, and it was effective enough where I think the physicality was letting them down was in transition defense. I think they didn't have enough players who were stepping up to make hits on players like Brian Melchior or Andrew Custers. And so when Toronto would get a fast break opportunity, it was just too often 10 points for the Raiders.
Yeah. I'm glad you highlighted the Levi Srinivasan connection, because it was something that was really consistently working for them. And when it wasn't because the ideas weren't right. I think, and that's what was so great about Detroit. I felt like so many of the ideas were right, and occasionally the execution just wasn't there yet. And if I'm a coach, I would always rather have the ideas be right and the execution and the fundamentals still coming along, because you can work on that. You can drill that. This team is so young. Gwen Pratt, who's a name we haven't even said yet, who also had a really good weekend, is going to be a sophomore next year. Ryan Sue is currently 20 years old. I mean, the stars of this team, so many of them have so much quiz left to play, and we're talking about now stepping up against players like Custers and Melchior, who are giant players who have played at the highest level, national team level, for Canada. Like it's the fact that these games were even close is such a testament to this coaching staff and how far they've brought along these really young players. And I think it's a super encouraging weekend from Detroit, even if maybe they didn't get the ultimate result they wanted, which was qualification. Nick, before we move on to our interview, do you have any other notes about Detroit?
I think one thing we have to point out is that some of the old men still got it. Rick Wasser was very effective for this team in limited minutes. Sort of burnt out a little bit by the end, but hey, when you're old, you've really only got the morning shift in you, and then after that, you rely on the young guns.
Yeah, that's why we play a morning 18 instead of a afternoon 18, Nick. Jack, any other last notes on Detroit?
Yeah, I'm just so optimistic about the future of the Innovators program. They started the season by going to Ann Arbor, going to East Lansing, and trying to recruit at the Michigan and Michigan State programs. And they got so many new additions. Beyond the state of Michigan, that they recruited Srinivasan from Purdue, a program that I believe is going official again next year. So that's really exciting. These players are going to continue to improve in USQ, and they're going to be back next year with something to prove.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it'd be completely wrong, given how much we talked about the coaching staff and how much it grew. I don't think we mentioned head coach Kagan Madeline once in this entire talk, and that's just incorrect, because obviously this culture and this development, this all stems from the coaching staff, stems from all of his coaches, but also specifically from Kagan himself. Also leading by example on the pitch, playing a lot of minutes for this team. Specifically defensively, physicality, probably their most defensively physical player. Would love to see a little bit more from him on the offensive side of physical, because he is a strong player. But yeah, definitely leads by example on the defensive end, and definitely leads by example in his coaching. So definitely worth mentioning as well. So before we jump on to our next team, we will have our interview for the night. It's a player we were just talking about a lot. Detroit beater Ryan Sue. Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time and joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So one of the things, if you were listening, you might have noticed, is we were talking a lot about your really aggressive style, the way you play. As a young player who is in a region where maybe you don't get to play with a ton of different beaters, where have you developed that style from, and kind of what made you want to play that way?
Yeah, so I'd say probably that inspiration comes a lot from being able to go to nationals this year. My eyes really kind of just opened wide to just the different levels of play and the different styles of beating that I was seeing. In particular, one of the things that I noticed was for the nationals final, Jack Wong. I saw him jump over 8 bludgers, and it's I want to start jumping. And so it was kind of just one of the things that really drives me as a player is when when I'm playing a match against an opposing team, when they do something that's really cool or really precise, I'm dang, I want to do that. I want to get better at that. And so that's definitely something that I wanted to incorporate. And also I definitely noticed playing throughout the season, playing against teams who have conservative beating cores, wondering how exactly you break through that. And in MLQ, I've kind of just learned, especially from the coaching staff, that you can kind of get in there and get dirty and close that gap, and I think and compress that defense. And so it's a combination of those things. So wanting to or being inspired by some of the players at nationals, and then coaching staff kind of helping me harness that. So.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned the conservative, because Nick and I, on our drive back to Chicago last night, were discussing the fact of when teams first started putting their beaters right under the hoops, it took us a year and change as a sport to figure out what we were going to do about it. So it's cool that now you can kind of watch and see the solutions as they go. You mentioned watching some beaters at nationals, but now obviously you've also got to play against some very high level beaters this season now in MLQ. What beaters did you really kind of enjoy the most or learn the most from playing against this season in MLQ?
Yeah. So there's a couple that stand out. Um, on when we played Indianapolis, definitely felt like I got schooled in almost any situation. Particularly with I believe it's Danny. I believe
You could, yep.
he's very good and very like composed beater where you don't really know what's going on inside his head. You know, the usual tricks I try to do, like when I'm running after a 50-50 ball, he was just not biting and was waiting for me to slip up. And so he's definitely a player that stood out to me. You also had a Evan Hoopengardner third bludger type deal where I had to go run after it, and I was the only beater in at the time, and it kind of hurt a little bit, but I was like, this is a good player. Um, Another person that stands out is Ben Strauss, which I actually the first time I met him was at Black Swamp Fantasy, and played against him, and he was just I saw him like quick on the field. I'm like, dang, like he is a really solid beater, knows when to be aggressive. And actually, I definitely noticed in the Cleveland matches, I felt like I wasn't really like in a good headspace for those. I kind of was putting a lot of pressure on myself, and it was a little intimidated by Strauss and playing him. And so I definitely want to give credit to his beating ability as well. But yeah, just MLQ in general, just the level of beating definitely opened my eyes as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Strauss is a player who's played some of the biggest minutes in the sport that exists, so it's definitely a good experience to go against someone like that. I want to talk to you a little about the team and your season. Obviously, as we were mentioning, a really, really young team. So let's start at the end. So you guys do get eliminated by Toronto in two pretty hard-fought games. It seemed from the outside like you guys were chin up, high mentality. So kind of what would you say kind of team goals were, and did it feel like you guys succeeded overall because you were continuing to grow game to game? Or were you guys obviously hoping to get a little bit more, but kind of where would you guys say your season was success, failure, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I would consider by all means that this season was a success for us. Going into it, Kagan and the other coaches talked about how, you know, the fact that we are young and that by the end of the season, just wanting to see some personal growth and improvement. And I certainly felt like I have experienced that, especially working with David Banis, showing us a lot of different ways to play. Like I didn't, before MQ or with MQ, not really knowing about kind of like a teeter-totter type style where, you know, like one beater's coming up and pressing from the side on the off ball side, which I really enjoy. And I was like, hey, why haven't we been doing this for a while now? Other things like swinging down by the hoops and tapping out the hoop chaser. Different strategies where I really felt like I learned how to do those things. It's still have a lot of improvement in those areas and getting used to doing those things, but yeah, I definitely think that as a whole team, we have very much improved. I know, like at the beginning, in our first couple of practices, getting used to playing with one another. Like none of us have played with each other. A lot of like mix of state and Michigan, and so I think there was maybe like a tendency for us to kind of like kind of stay like play, be comfortable with our players, and maybe not be able to work with the other ones. But I felt like the coaches did a really good job of bringing all of our strengths together so that we could be a really solid team by the end of it. So I think it's certainly a win for us as a team.
So beyond on pitch play, sorry, kind of you guys coming from so many different places, but your bench coherence is really high, and kind of the energy your bench brings. It's something Keegan Madeline even highlighted when we did a pre-series interview with him before the tournament. So kind of what factors or what people are kind of behind that, and kind of how have you kind of grown as a team off the field throughout the season?
Yeah, I certainly think that Kagan is somebody as a coach who really brings like an energy and enthusiasm, and a you can do this and get this done, and let's go out there and play well. I think that's something that really much radiates whenever we're doing our like huddle um, before playing. It's always like he's bringing the energy to our chant. And I feel like also on the team, I'll give credit to a lot of the state people. They're very enthusiastic people. Whenever we do like 1-2-3, 1-3, they always finish with 2-1. And none of us really join in, but it's kind of like a funny thing that happens. And so we can laugh about it. And it's something where like a lot of the people, like the coaching staff, is really close. And I think that also like resonates with the rest of us as players, where they're all really good friends and they've been playing with each other for a while and working with one another. And so like when we see that and we see that how they're working together, it definitely reflects on how we should be communicating to each other as players. When people are coming off, we're always encouraging and saying like really good shift, like really nice job. And it's definitely something that I want to continue in MQ. So.
Yeah. Hey, Ryan. My question sort of ties back into that Michigan Quidditch background. Michigan Quidditch is a team that's for a long, long time been known for its chasing, depth, and physicality. And that was definitely the case this last year with a bunch of very large players and a strong marked defense. This Detroit team's a little bit different in that it plays a lot of zone looks. It plays a lot more through its beaters to do a lot of the work, shall we say. Can you sort of talk about the difference between playing with like such a big physical program as Michigan and then sort of moving to this more refined technical program in the Innovators?
Yeah, so I would definitely. It's an interesting question because I'm not sure which play style there's objectively if I enjoyed more. I think I enjoyed MLQ more just because I grew as a player and I was able to do more. But I don't know if that's necessarily attributed to the style of play we played necessarily. I think you can enjoy both like a very drive heavy team and also a like passing methodical team. Um, but I definitely would agree that it was very different where I think our for the most part in MQ for our season, we would have more of a conservative beater core. And then on offenses, we would occasionally run like blitz and recovery, and that was kind of our two main goals as beaters. But didn't get too complicated beyond that, and we were relying a lot on chasers and keepers like Andrew Stevenson to drive through and make things happen. And so I would say I enjoyed both styles. I kind of hope next year to kind of combine the best of both worlds. I think it's pretty common, at least from what I see when people talk about strategy, to kind of like there's a saying like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but taking the best parts of each strategy and putting them together rather than maybe something doesn't work out and you say, oh, the whole play is not good. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, hey Ryan. I have a question that I always like asking younger players, especially with the way that the pandemic has impacted college teams. But how did you come to Quidditch, and give me the backstory of you and MQ?
Yeah, sounds great. So I started playing right at the start of 2020, so January. Um, and it was actually an interesting story because I hadn't really like thought about Quidditch or anything. I was just walking through a university building. And I saw a recruiting table with I don't know if any of you are familiar with the player Gwen Selfka, but she played for Iceland for a bit and is a Michigan alum. But she was at the table and she was just kind of like sitting there like doing her thing, and I was really interested because like how do you make Quidditch a sport? And so I went in and just asking her a bunch of rules questions, and I really didn't have any interest in joining. It seemed a little. At the time I thought it was kind of a nerdy thing, and so I was like, I don't know about this. But then, just by chance, Jack Levy walks up behind me and he's like, "Oh, hey, Ryan." And I'm like, "Hey," and he's like, "You're gonna join the Quidditch team?" I'm like, "I don't think so." And he was like, "You should come to a practice." And me and him had actually met in Model UN the previous fall, and become good friends there. And so I was like, okay, I guess I'll go to a practice. And so then went to the first practice, and it was indoor because of Michigan winter, and I just really like fell in love with just the variety of gameplay that you can experience and how you can play as a player. Like any player of different body type, personality, what they gravitate to can be used in some sort of special way. And I also found it was kind of more of like a puzzle of like how to not break the rules. I remember the first days I was like, I saw two bludgers at my feet. My partner had one. I was like, oh, can I just like roll this bludger behind my hoops and make it really annoying to the person? Like, oh, you can't do that. I'm like, oh, third bludger interference? What's that? And so it definitely like um, played into just kind of like I feel like throughout high school, like the sports that I enjoyed most were kind of more like unconventional, like capture the flag type things. Like I played soccer, but I was always like kind of bench warmer, not very like involved in that. And so I felt like Quidditch was just like the rules set itself, and the sport and the people really lended itself to kind of just an odd set of like rules that you could just do what you want with. And learn how to play. So I felt like I kind of gravitated towards that. So I thank Jack Levy for getting me into the sport, because I wouldn't be here today without that.
Yeah, I love that. Model UN coming up big for MQ. Did you play before the pandemic in a tournament, or did you have to wait all the time before like playing in your first real game?
Yeah, so at the time we had Bear Train and Michigan, and I forget the name of. I went to one tournament, I think, and played with Bear Train, and I played a couple of teams, and I don't really remember it that well. But I didn't really get to play too much before the pandemic kind of shut everything down. We all got sent back home, and then during the whole COVID year, wasn't really involved in Quidditch really. We held some like virtual workout sessions, but I wasn't really involved in that. So the first like real year where like I felt like I was able to kind of grow and like experience the sport as a player was this last year, my junior year, on the team, leading up to nationals, which was a huge experience for me. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. And moving forward, tell us what to expect from MQ and this upcoming year. How are you feeling heading into the USQ season?
Yeah, I am very excited with the opportunities that we have to grow as a program. I'm sure every team out there is looking for a big recruiting year this year, as are we. I'm really optimistic about our coaching staff this upcoming year, or I guess our captain staff. Jack Levy, chaser captain, Elizabeth Williams, who also plays in Detroit, beater captain. Ray, my beater partner, head captain, and our other head captain, George Daring, which I don't know if his name's brought up that much, but he's off like practicing with Scotland, I think. And so it's a lot of like branching out, experiencing high levels of play with MQ or international. And I'm really excited to see how they bring together all of those ideas and build off of what we did this last nationals to come up with some strategy early on to get it really settled in and have a good program to be competitive for regionals and nationals. I'm also especially hoping that I think sometimes in a sport, we get into this trap of when we're learning a play where we're teaching the memorization versus teaching the learning. And one like piece of the cog falls apart, and then teams struggle with, especially newer players, learning plays. And so I'm excited to see what all these players, after experiencing learning the plays in a really like positive environment with like the innovators, for example, and their method of coaching, bringing those teaching styles to Michigan to make it successful.
Just one final question before we let you go. I just want to ask you about your main beating partner, because you guys did try to switch things up a little bit early in the season, which I think makes a lot of sense. But when it all came down to it, especially down the stretches, it was a lot of you playing with Ray Brodeur. So how do you guys work as a team? What do you think her strengths are, and kind of how do you guys meld together so well on the pitch?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting because I think starting out when me and Ray were playing, I was probably more aggressive than I should have been, and I felt like I was making her clean up after my mess. But as we started playing longer and longer, we definitely both got used to each other's style of play. I think we balanced each other out well, where when I'm looking to kind of be aggressive and to compress things, I feel like I'm looking for her to make an initial, like maybe one tap out of a chaser, just remove one passing option so I can condense things to a side. And I think that works really well. She usually has a better game sense of where balls are and is better about getting a ball back to me. And so it's a really nice, like, it's kind of almost like she's like my field vision sometimes, and is kind of setting things up for me to kind of just be chaotic, which I really appreciate. She's also just an amazing catcher, and has the speed to kind of match what I want to do on a field. And so I definitely think that we've worked very well this last year, and I'm excited to see if we, stick as partners, or if with the recruiting class, you never know if things will change. But I definitely think we balance each other out well in that way.
Awesome. Well, it's important not to be the kind of hyper aggressive beater that makes your partner go chase down your mistakes. So I'm glad you've learned that lesson already.
Yeah.
Ryan, thanks so much for taking the time. Best of luck to Michigan Quidditch this season, and also the innovators going into next year. And you take care and have a good night.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, so we will now move down the line to the team that did eliminate the innovators and ended up capturing the fourth seed in the North Division. That is the Toronto Raiders. The Raiders, oh, I wouldn't say they're necessarily roster light given what they've brought, but a couple people who are on the general roster that we just haven't been able to see a ton of continue to not be present. Team was definitely short on female and gender non-conforming players this weekend. Brittany Kahane was basically playing everywhere on the pitch for this team, as was Robin Zhu, being asked for a lot of minutes and a lot of positions as well. But that said, they had a lot of core players, veteran players, and they still had kind of an up and down weekend. Jack, what did you think were kind of behind some of Toronto's struggles this weekend? Or kind of were they the team you expected them to do that weekend? Let me reframe it that way.
Yeah, I think you're right to start with the lack of women and gender nonconforming individuals on the roster this weekend. I think that was tough for the Raiders early on to figure out exactly what their best lineups on the field were, especially against an intensity team that has played so much together and can count on players like Nathan Digman to score 6 goals in a game. I think early on the Raiders were figuring out what worked for them. And as the weekend went on, I think they realized that they could create a lot of opportunities for fast breaks. And there were times where they could have pressed more, but they were winning their exchanges deep in their zone and often could capitalize on a dropped pass or a blocked shot and just run the other way. And with their athleticism in the open field, this is a very well-conditioned Toronto team, a team that brought physicality all weekend. They could break tackles and score. And so as the weekend went on, especially against the Innovators in the elimination game, they could lean on some of their more experienced ball carriers to get the job done.
Yeah. Nick, in the beater game, I feel like it kind of remained up and down. And it's what we've seen a lot of this season, where, these very strong, historically, Toronto beaters, even, in this Detroit series, I think there were periods where, Ryan and Ray were kind of running over them at times. And definitely in the Indy series, very, very similar things were happening. Do you think the way we were just talking to Ryan about the fact that it's hard to improve if you're not seeing these good beaters all the time, do you think that's something that just these Canadian beaters kind of need to get up to speed again with, of just like that more consistent play against other really high quality beaters?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I also think the other part of it is that the Quaffle and beater game was completely out of sync for Toronto this weekend, and it is so hard to do anything in either of those when they're out of sync. If one is going too quickly, as we saw a little bit from Detroit this weekend, with their Quaffle game sort of throwing away possessions before their beaters could get back into the play sometimes. We saw that with Toronto on both ends, right? Whether their beaters were too aggressive and getting out of the play too quickly, or their Quaffle game was going while the beaters were trying to recover a third bludger or something like that. It becomes very difficult. But I do think part of that is the not necessarily getting to play against these. I mean, we're talking about, right, Ryan and Ray are college players at this point, and their highs are higher than some of the college players that we've ever had in the past in an MLQ season. And so I think the level of play is just getting higher and higher throughout the U.S., and it's going to take a little bit of time for this Canadian beater core to catch up.
Yeah. Jack, in the Quaffle game, when Toronto needed a spark plug this weekend, one place they seem to be consistently getting it is not from any of those giant Quaffle players that we know and love at this point. It was from Levi Medeiros. What did you see from him and what he contributed to the team this weekend?
Yeah, I really liked watching Levi Medeiros. I think it was an ability to cover lots of ground with his speed and just get by defenders without a pass or just juking them out. He was using all areas of the field, and yeah, I think in the past the Raiders have gotten some of that from a player like Michael Wanless. They are also a very speedy chaser, but and the Raiders have speed up and down their roster. But Medeiros, I think, was able to kind of make some of the North Division chasers uncomfortable with just how quick he was.
Yeah. Nick, this Toronto team has a very, very full schedule coming up before championships now. Next week, they play the Scavenger Showdown against Ottawa. The following week, they go down and scrimmage Charlotte at the site of where this U.S.-Canada team. Most of these players are then going to play Team USA and Team USA DA that Friday. Then 2 weeks later, they're going to go to championship. Given all of that, do you think we will see a very similar Toronto team or a significantly better team, given what we were talking about those reps you need against other good players?
I mean, this team, we talk about a lot of the old veterans on this team, but a lot of the players that played this year, they played their first Quidditch 6 months ago, right? A lot of the players that put in big minutes, and there's nothing better than more reps at that point in time. And Michael Howard knows this. Michael Howard is a very smart coach. I'm sure we'll talk about his play this weekend in a little bit. But from a coaching standpoint, getting those reps over the next few weeks for these players that they're going to have to rely on if they want to make it out of the play-in bracket at MLQ Championships is going to help him to sort of focus and refine some of these skills. Like we've seen these flashes from Medeiros, right? If we can take that and focus that over the next few weeks, that's going to be huge.
Yeah. I also think Charlotte's a great opponent for them where, it's not an opponent that's going to run them off the field to the point where they won't get good reps, but it's also a team with very good beaters, which is going to be important for, as we said, continuing to develop this beating game. Nick, I'm just going to throw it back to you since you brought it up. And I know you've been high on him all season. What did you see from Michael Howard this season in the quaffle game on the field?
We talk about Nathan Digman's impact on Indy. Michael Howard is that for Toronto. The passing instantly gets sharper. It gets far less reserved. It takes we talked about off camera, teams are less willing than ever, it seems, to take some of those high risk passing options that aren't necessarily as high risk as they think. But Michael Howard is willing to try and thread that needle. We saw that in the Rochester series. A little bit less so in terms of, we'll say, results this weekend from those passes, but the process was there. The players were open around hoops and in deadly areas, and the ball was getting to them. And maybe some of this inexperience led to maybe not scoring in those opportunities. But does continue to be sort of the cog that makes this Toronto wheel turn all the way through and through.
Right, and I think another important cog that they didn't have this weekend that'll be fun to see come back is Joanne Lamb, who plays so well off ball, plays well on ball as well. And, there felt like sometimes it would have been like Michael Howard was almost looking for a Joanne Lamb that didn't exist on the field at that moment. It'll be fun to see her come back into the team, and hopefully she'll be with them at championship. One other player I want to highlight, Jack, is Custers, who is a lot of times the player on the receiving end of Michael Howard passes. But I actually don't want to talk about his offensive side because what I see is one of the fieriest, most consistent defensive players I've seen in kind of on the field. And the amount of times I've seen Custers get beat out of a play on a fast break and get back to a hoop and make a diving stop that nobody else even goes for is so impressive. So what have you seen from him on either side of the ball, but specifically on the defensive side?
Yeah, it's the defense and the tackling around the hoops. That's where games are won and lost. And Custers was stepping up and making those hits all weekend long. He's going to be so key for them as they progress through the next tough couple weeks, like you mentioned. He's got to stay healthy for the Raiders to make a run through bracket play.
Yeah, of course, again, taking a knock against Rochester definitely set them back in that series. Nick, we've talked a lot about Smithson, who is a true utility player for this team and who got another grab this weekend. This weekend was weird. Something we haven't really talked about was the presence and effect of Derek Parker in the snitch game. Teams were getting nowhere on him for large sections of this weekend. A little bit more so down the stretch on Sunday. I think the legs might get getting tired. He was on maybe game 10, 11 of snitching for the weekend. But do you have any concerns just on the fact that Smithson struggled a little bit more in that matchup? He did come up with another catch this weekend, despite all that. Or do you think he can continue to be an effective option for them or an important option for them at
I
championship.
think important is the key word there. I think we saw this whole weekend, we saw North Seeker struggle. Right, Riley Andrews is going to be a key addition for this Indianapolis team because they have struggled all year. Minneapolis continues to struggle in the Seeker game. Rochester, outside of Kip Palpour this weekend, was struggling throughout the Seeker game. That's a thing. And if going up against these teams with great Seekers, right, the TJ Jenneret of Washington, the Ryan Davis of Charlotte, Smithson is going to be able to, at the very least, understand what they have to do at Seeker, regardless of whether Toronto chooses to play in that game or not. And that's very important for this team.
Yeah. And of course, as we mentioned multiple times, we still haven't seen this full Toronto roster. Zach McDonald and Sam McCall are Team Canada top line, maybe the number one line as we left it back pre-COVID. Obviously, we haven't seen a lot of these Canadian players for a very long time. We've yet to see either of them. We mentioned Joanne Lamb not being here this weekend. One thing that is so evident and makes me scared to predict too much for any of these teams in championship is this lower bracket is going to be a dogfight this season. We now know that Toronto is going to be in it. We know that this Indy team is going to be in it. We know that one of New York, Boston, or Washington is going to be in it. Charlotte's in it for sure, and then two teams from the South. It's going to be absolutely crazy. It's going to be nothing like last year where the North was down a couple teams and KC wasn't able to fly out. Every game is going to be so challenging. So I want to say that this Toronto team is the kind of team that could qualify on the lower bracket, but I'm just so scared to say it given how strong the bracket's going to be. Jack, what do you think as our kind of North correspondent about Toronto's chances in the lower bracket?
Yeah, I think we'll have to see how they grow over the next couple weeks, especially against Charlotte and the U.S. National team and the Development Academy. These are big reps for the Raiders program, and I'm excited to see what they can make of them. Right now, I'd pick some of those other teams you mentioned, but I'm not ruling anything out. There's a lot of chance for improvement over the next month.
Awesome. All right. Let's jump to our two championship teams now, starting with the team who came up short, which is the Rochester Whiteout. Kind of a weird weekend for Rochester. I hate harping on roster things, and I know we've talked about them on and off with some teams, but down Bassam Ashkar, down Mitch Vargas, down Solly Gominiak, and I'd say more so than any of the other rosters, it was felt. It just didn't seem like there were enough offensive options for this Rochester team. Jack, what do you think about, kind of what we saw, both the high points and the low points of the Quaffle offense?
Yeah, I mean, without a ball handler like Bassam Ashkar, Kip Palpour, usually an off-ball option, had to step into the role of a ball carrier, and a player like Caleb Van Buren had some nice moments off-ball, but you really missed the production that Palpour was giving you in the wings and in the spaces behind the hoops. They just didn't have a player who could consistently feed him with accurate passes. You really saw what Ashkar brings offensively for the Whiteout.
Yeah, because Nick, what I was seeing at least, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, it seemed like they were running similar offensive fundamentals. They just didn't necessarily have the personnel to execute down the stretch or to find that scoring option. It didn't seem like they weren't necessarily well drilled. It just seemed like maybe this is kind of similar to what we were talking about with Detroit. The ideas were there, it was just the execution was kind of lacking with the personnel.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like this Rochester team came into this weekend looking to get players who don't get a lot of reps in these big games, big reps. Right, we saw Kip Palpour ball carrying at times. Alyssa Giarosa was here, and I don't think she had the ball in her hands up top more than 3 or 4 times when she has ball carried all season. This team, I think, really came into this weekend with the idea of, hey, we're maybe down some of our top line. We're going to take a little bit, we're going to settle a little bit back. We're going to get the bottom end of our team a lot of reps because we're going to rely on them so heavily in this coming up in championships.
Yeah, and ultimately, the difference between first seed and second seed in our current MLQ championship format, obviously you don't get a North Division championship, and that matters. Obviously, it still matters. But both teams get biased to quarterfinals. You definitely get a more difficult matchup by not winning the division, but you're still getting to the same rung on the totem pole. And, if the development minutes are going to be more worthwhile than maybe the matchup you're going to get, especially if you're down a few players, it makes some sense. That said, I think there is a bigger concern than the Quaffle game, which I think will be just fine. We've seen it all season. We've seen a lot of these players for most of their careers, Kit Palpour, Mitch Vargas, Bassam Ashkar, Ostiros, all these players, they're going to contribute. It's not going to be a problem. They had their beater game and they got bodied by Minneapolis. We're gonna give Nick plenty of runway to wax poetic about Minneapolis's beating game. But that said, there are a lot of good beating games in the quarterfinals of championships. So, Jack, how worried about the beating game are you after this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a very tough weekend for an experienced beater pair like Emily Hickmott and Pat Callanan. I think there were times where they were getting unlucky and bludgers were bouncing the wrong way and they were spiraling a little bit, just couldn't catch a break, it seemed like. Um, I think they'll also benefit from the addition of Sully Gominiak, who's been playing more and more minutes at beater for the Whiteout, and has made a really nice impact in some games. I think if they can get their heads straight and come together again and analyze the film. And come into MLQ championships focused, I think they'll have a shot to play more evenly with any team. But yeah, certainly not their best weekend.
Are we sure that this Rochester beater core wasn't just shining on the back of their high 2-2 press, throwing teams off heading into this? Like it just.
I know if you were asking us or if that was the start of your monologue. It was very unclear.
No. I can speak on it a little bit, I guess.
Go for
my
it.
thing is, this Rochester team came in having played their high press 2-2 all year, and then comes in and plays super conservatively, super far back against this team in a defense we've watched Minneapolis break down all year pretty confidently. And so I thought it was really interesting that this team, which has had such an identity, all the way up and down the line, didn't necessarily try to stick with that for even a little bit in this game. And I think that bit these Rochester beaters, because once you start going up against the Minneapolis beater core, which we'll talk about later, but they are so fundamentally sound that if you don't throw something odd at them, they're going to capitalize on it.
No, yeah, for sure. And I think that strategic change is really a big factor. I do wonder if it was personnel based or whether it was strategic based. You could really say either one. I would say I have to assume it was personnel based because why not try it at some point when the other strategy is not working? But it'll be interesting to see if it comes back a championship and if it can kind of step up that the way that beating core can play again. One thing we did say, we were talking about the strength of Derek Parker in the snitch game. Kit Palpour had a fundamental, just textbook grab of him in a big moment that put Rochester back into a game against Minneapolis. They weren't obviously ultimately able to complete the comeback. But when we're talking about spoilers, when we're talking about Rochester's not going to be favored in whatever their matchup. They're probably going to play one of the number one teams from either the East or the South. They're not going to be favored in that matchup. But having a Kit Palpour who can do it does make a difference. Jack, what do you think about the idea of this team having to play, let's say it is, if it's Austin or if it's Boston, New York, or Washington, one of those first place teams?
I think this is a team that can definitely spring an upset. I think they're a team that last year beat beat Washington in a game at home. They're a team that in 2019 made it out of the play-in bracket. So this is a team that can spring some upsets on favored teams just with their togetherness and physicality. It's a team that I think 1 and 2 seeds would not necessarily want to play.
Yeah, and going all the way back to 2018 even, not to bring back bad memories from Nick's past, but you could argue the 2 games that Rochester gave Austin at that championships were every bit as good as the 2 games Boston gave them in that final. So yeah, obviously a long history of overachieving or just playing very well. And hey, some of these players were still with that team that, I mean, was playing for a USQ national championship way back. I mean, this veteran squad with youth coming in is not the kind of team that's going to be scared off. Oh, and some of these players have also won USQ championships at the college level. There's plenty of major national tournament experience here. So it'll be interesting to see how things do play out for this team as they get back up to their full roster in a few weeks. We're running quite long, so let's move on to our champions. As we said, our back-to-back champions of the North now. No migration of the trophy, as Reed so eloquently put it. The Minneapolis Monarchs, undefeated, which is something they weren't able to accomplish last year because they dropped that one game to Cleveland. They are undefeated this year in the North. They haven't lost a series in the North since 2019. Another great performance. And we'll just get out of the way. Me and Jack are just going to walk off. We'll go drink some water. Nick, talk to us about the Minneapolis Beating Corps.
This young Minneapolis Beating Corps is special. There is, we've talked about it all year. I mean, Gracie Johnson took a step this year that we do not see ever, right? We have seen gradual improvements to this level. We have never seen from last year, where she was very strong, to this year being an absolute dominant force. Whether it's moving off the ball, like off the engage play of some of her more aggressive partners, to playing that aggressive engage role, she is all over the field all the time. Absolutely terrifying to play against. There was one play this weekend where there's a stoppage of play and she doesn't have a ball, and she chases down the Rochester beater from 7-8 yards away, full sprint, gets in front of them, takes the ball away, and then turns around and continues to make a play against the Rochester Quaffle Corps. It is an absolute joy to watch her play. And that's not even talking about her main partner, Cody Narveson, who has always been a very, very solid beater. But this year is playing with a confidence that we haven't seen from him. He is aggressive. He is catching everything. He is playing against these other teams in a way that we've seen very rarely at this level. It is confident, it is aggressive, it is taking his space, and it is asserting himself on the field. We talk about this pow poor catch, but this Minneapolis snitch on pitch Beating Corps is a masterclass in what you want to watch with this team.
The game one shift that the two of them put on, it went like 5 or 6 minutes, which is absolutely I'm speaking snitch on pitch, which is absolutely insane to think about because snitch on pitch is the most tiring thing. I mean, I've been blessed to watch some incredible snitch on pitch beaters. The fact of the matter is, in snitch on pitch beating, sometimes you're going to lose an exchange because it's just constant exchanges, and for 5 or 6 minutes, you can't win them all. They did not lose an exchange against Rochester for literally 5 or 6 minutes in a row. It was unbelievable. Their catching and their blocking was absolutely nuts. And that's kind of what we've been seeing from this pair. That said, it's not just about this pair. Obviously, April Grabner, who we were able to see back this weekend, she did pick up another knock, unfortunately. But in the minutes we did see from her, it was very solid. We knew that when Gracie Johnson subs out, we're going to get April Grabner, we're going to get Nicole Nelson. There's talent there. What I was excited about, and Jack, I want you to touch a little bit on this, was the performance of Nathan Podolski, because we didn't really know what would happen when Cody subs out. And I thought we got a very strong weekend from Nathan Podolski.
Yeah, Podolski is a player who watches a ton of film, and you could see it. He's really aggressive, a high-risk player, but the bets were paying off this weekend, as they have. We've seen glimpses all season, but the consistency was there from Podolski. He was cutting down on some of the mistakes, and just making life difficult for whatever beaters he was playing against. Yeah, really impressive weekend from him.
Nick, on the quaffle side. Oh yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, last year, this Minneapolis Beater Corps was a beating corps that didn't make those fundamental mistakes, and this year we've seen them take that leap as a whole. From the top line is playing dominant, aggressive play, and then everyone down the line isn't making mistakes. Right, April Grabner came off, and for the limited minutes she played, it looked like she hadn't missed a step. She was playing confidently and filling in this space. They had to mix through the lines the whole way through, right? All three, Gracie Johnson, April Grabner, Nicole Nelson, picked up a knock at one point or another throughout this, and they had to all play with different partners, even going to a 2-male set at some points, right, with Ben Schlitter and Cody Narveson. And that completely, like, it looked like they didn't miss a step the whole way through, and that's something that can't be said of a lot of teams. Last year when Lulu Zhu went down for Boston, it did look for a little bit like that team was a bit shaky, and that's not the case with this Minneapolis beater core.
Yeah, and I do want to just go back and say really fast, you mentioned that play by Gracie Johnson where she ran up and just took that ball back. It wasn't just against any beater. It was against Brady Grow, who was probably the largest, most physical beater at the entire tournament. So just an extra step on that. We mentioned kind of the way that this beater core is, being complete, starting to show more complete games. What I also saw this weekend, I thought, is some of these quaffle players starting to show a little bit more complete games. I'll use an oversimplification to highlight this. I feel like a little bit of the way Max Meyer plays quaffle has become a meme on the offensive end. Everyone knows he's going right. Everyone knows he's going to circle around. I think the fact that there were one or two instances where he went left, hit the lane, and threw a pass just speaks to the fact that this team is becoming aware of the fact that maybe there's certain parts of their game that have not always been fully complete, and they're trying to fix that. Jack, what did you see from the quaffle game of Minneapolis?
Yeah, I think you're right to point out the diversification in their offense, trying some different things. Another player who is one of their patented goal scorers, Alex O'Banner, was in some different positions throughout the weekend. Often a player who drives, but I think he was on the receiving end of a couple alley-oops, just making well-timed cuts. And the whole team, I think, was just building upon the progress from last week, and especially against Indianapolis at home, when the incisive cuts that they were making were really picking apart at times the Indy zone. That's how they're going to look to break down defenses, and as they build on what they've been doing. They can even add more complexity to their movement on the offensive end.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned all these players getting in different spots. We've talked a lot about Emma Persons this season, and she did pick up a knock in game one, and I think was a little bit more limited than she's been at times. But the fact that they can kind of play her in a role, I think very similar to the way that the Titans and Warriors have used Lindsay Morel through the years, is allowing all these players to kind of play all these different roles, get into all these different positions. And you're right, I do think O'Banner did cook for this team for large periods of time this weekend. Let's go to the one at the low note. Nick, it seems like this team is never going to catch a snitch in a million years. Can this, how much lower than otherwise their ceiling would be pushed, do you feel about that fact? And how sad are you that your seeker, Henry Bear Benson, is not with them this season?
I mean, Henry's making us all look bad elsewhere in the world right now, so that's good for him. And he'll be back. He'll be putting on a show in a couple weeks, I'm sure of it. But I mean, it pushes their ceiling low at this point, right? This is a team that they're probably going to struggle in the quarterfinals against whoever they match up against, whoever they choose, and it requires a snitch grab, right? I think they're going to play very solid Quidditch against this team, but I do think it's going to be very hard to spring what won't be an upset, but it might look like one without those snitch grabs if they do this. I mean, this is a team that looks focused in every aspect. This is a team that is dominating around the seeker, and then the seekers just aren't delivering. And you did talk about, right, that the snitches this weekend were very, very solid. But this has been all year that we've seen issues from this team. And it's not like the snitches are going to be any less solid at MLQ Championship.
No, for sure. So, Nick, you mentioned the selection. So, Minneapolis, and more specifically, head coach Cody Narveson, for the second straight year, will be coming on this show in a few weeks. And he'll have to choose whether he wants to play the second-place team from the North or the second-place team from the South in his quarterfinal. Let's say, given those recent KC results, that we do think San Antonio is going to be the second place team in the South when the dust settles. Jack, out of the three teams from the East, are there any you would pick to play as Minneapolis over San Antonio, or would you always go San Antonio?
Oh, that's a tough question. Maybe Washington if they slide into the second spot. I think if you're Minneapolis, you are possibly looking to avoid the same type of look that you got last season from the aggressive beating core of the Boston Forge. And the New York Titans have shown over the course of the season that they're a similar type of team with Devin Lee and Tessa Mullins leading the charge for them. So I think you want to avoid those beater cores. The problem is that San Antonio also is working with Daniel Williams. Now, I think uh, the quaffle depth is maybe not as strong for the Soldados as it was for the Forge last year. So maybe with the growth in your beater game, if you're the Monarchs, you take a bet on San Antonio. But I think if you're the Monarchs, you're hoping that the Admirals fall into the second spot in the East.
Yeah, Nick, what do you think?
I think you might want to play the Titans a little bit if they fall into that second spot. I mean, I know Devin Lee's got the highest of highs all the time, but he has proven to be sort of inconsistent throughout. And while we talk about the ever-present possibility that is Tate K coming back to this team, we don't know if that's the case yet, right? We don't know if Rachel Ayala Silver is coming back for this team. I don't believe she will be this summer. But the fact is that, are we certain that Cody Narveson and Gracie Johnson match up super poorly against Devin Lee and Tessa Mullins? I mean, Devin Lee lives and thrives on catching, and Cody Narveson's been catching balls all season, right? And Gracie Johnson seems to have taken that leap into the maybe not totally elite tier, but approaching elite tier that we sort of have seen from Tessa Mullins this year. And with that New York team, that is, while playing a lot in transition, hasn't necessarily shown the half-court ideas. If this Minneapolis beater core can play to parity and sort of slow that team down and get it out of its transition-looking offense, it might tend to struggle a little bit more.
Yeah. I do wonder how many sleepless nights Narveson's had about not picking San Antonio because he wasn't working with perfect information. He did not know that Daniel Williams and Miguel Esparza wouldn't be with the team that weekend, and whether that subconsciously affects his decision, where it's like, what if I don't pick San Antonio again? They, again, just aren't that strong. And I screw up a second time by letting them go and pick an East team. But yeah, obviously he's got a lot to think about. And we've still got a ton of Quidditch to play before he can even make this decision. We've got a huge South Super Series coming up this weekend where so far nobody in the South has technically clinched MLQ championship yet. We all assume Austin will be this weekend, and the results of this weekend will start to clinch things. But this Kansas City-New Orleans series is going to be absolutely huge for deciding even what team doesn't make it from the South, which is very much up in the air after the League City sweep. In the East Division, we have New York-Boston this weekend. There's a result between New York-Boston, which I believe is Boston 2-1, that would leave the opportunity open for a three-way tie for first place in the East Division. And then we've got to finish it up both the completion of Game 3, Boston-Washington, and also that League City San Antonio series that could still have a lot of implications. So there is so much good Quidditch left. We were absolutely blessed, though, to see the North Division regular season end on such a high note with that championship. We thank you guys, everyone, for watching. We're going to call it a night here, but please tune into all of our content. Check out our series of the week next week, which me and Nick will be at. It will be the New York versus Boston series, a classic rivalry in all sports and definitely as well in our sport. Thank you guys, everyone, for watching. Thank you, Jack and Nick, for taking the time after just getting back from your respective travels to North Division championships. And we hope you tune in next week. Take care.